type of situations. Only in the 20th century does recognition of individual identities become political. So now we're talking about gender-related things. We're talking about the gay movement. We're talking about indigenous movement. We're talking about and any of this type of indigenous doesn't fit in this category, but gay, trans, different lifestyles, these kind of things. That is today what dominates politics, right? And not what dominates politics, but it's one of the most talked about things in politics is recognition of identities, right? This is what your generation cares about, not me, but you are usually quite attentive when we talk about these type of things that have to do with identity, that have to do with emotion, that have to do with respect, is in my experience what young people react to a lot, and a lot more than other issues. So either it is about recognition of these identities, or there's also a lot of political debate about a reaction against them, right? You have a lot of people who are hostile towards certain identities, who are hostile, for example, towards gay people, who are hostile towards people from other cultures, right? There's quite a strong reaction against it. Think of Trump's movement, for example. So from both sides, we are being, in a way, manipulated based on our identity, right? Politicians are going to use our longing for identity either to get recognition for your particular identity, or for you to protect your identity by not supporting others, right? Politicians are going to use that to support their existing ideology. A good example, the little picture below, this is from Hillary Clinton's campaign 2016. She was going full in on identity politics and having all kind of warm type slogans that didn't mean anything at all, right? I believe in love and kindness. Yeah, that's a very bad program for a president because it doesn't mean anything. But it connects to a certain generation that feel unloved. And it feels that the world is too harsh. So politicians kind of pander to our longing for this. But that's identity politics in general, right? From a more critical perspective. Now, within identity politics, there are two struggles that are significantly more important or that stand out than others, I would say, if you look at history as a whole. And I want to also preface this by saying, and to be very transparent in that, I'm not terribly interested in identity politics. Not because there's anything wrong with it, I just have more socioeconomical interests. Students sometimes think I am, but I want to have that clear. But there are two struggles, though, that really stand out to me, both in historical depth and in scope, that are just bigger in a way. One of them is the struggle for racial equality, especially that of black people. This is a very old struggle. It's a struggle that affects millions of people, right? It's big in its scope and it's big in its depth. And it's a struggle that has actually made relatively little advance. If you look at all kind of different groups that are vying for respect, black people probably have it the hardest. They probably faced one of the biggest pushbacks against them. Still to this day. So this is a very big struggle affecting hundreds of millions of people globally, and still relatively unresolved. The other issue that is that really stands out to me is that of feminism in scope, because it affects, well, half the world population, right? And especially also in historical depth, because it's as old as civilization. Rapidly gaining ground in recent years, but it's been a very long road, right? Then you have other struggles, but they're moving more rapidly, right? If you think of the trans identity agenda, right, is much younger and has, if you compare to black people, for example, has advanced much quicker in recent years, even if that might not seem that fast to the people inside that movement. So today we're going to zoom in on one particular type of identity politics, that is feminism. Now, since it's a big debate, right, it's important that we have some conceptual clarity, that we understand the same thing by the same words, all of us. So my understanding of feminism, right, is quite simple. I want to keep it simple. I would say that feminism is a political movement that primarily focuses on two things. First one is political, legal, and social equality for man and woman. So feminism is about having equality between the sexes in different domains. And these domains are distinct. They historically happen at different times, the struggle for political, legal, and social equality. The second thing that feminism is about is not just about equality, it's also about drawing political attention towards issues that women face in specific, right? It's not just about equality, it's also about the politics of women, right? The politics of things that affect a woman, like maternity, like security, these type of things, right? So feminists both stand up for female issues and stand up for equality. That, in my simple understanding, is what feminism is about. Within these discussions we're going to have, there are two words that I'm going to use that can be confusing if you don't understand the difference between them. They are sex and gender. They often are used as the same thing, but they're not the same thing. Sex, not as a verb, but as a single word, refers to the biological differences between Homo sapiens, between male and female, right? When you are conceived, your first cell is either going to be XX or XY. Yes, there is a very hard difference in the first second you exist between if you're male and female. And that's simply biological categories that all mammals have, and we are no exception to that. Gender, however, is about what this means to society. It's about what it means to be a man or a female, a woman. It's about what it culturally and socially means that you are that. It's about the identity and the roles that we associate with that. So it's not about male or female, it's about masculinity and femininity, right? It's about what is expected of you as a man or expected of you as a woman, or at least how that is performed. That is gender. So while sex is a biological category, gender is a construct, right? It's something, it depends on the norms of society, which could change. So masculinity and femininity can change over time. Sex, not so much. Now, with that, right, feminism, of course, questions gender, but that doesn't mean it's the same thing as all questioning of gender, right? Feminism is not the same as the queer movement, which tries to blur these categories. It's not, some feminists question these categories, but there's a difference between fighting for equality and fighting for women issues and reacting against the idea of man and woman as being different, right? So don't confuse, let's say, the queer movement and the feminist movement, even if they partly overlap. All right, I hope this is clear enough to you. Do you still hear me clearly?
Yes.
Yes, Professor.
Okay. So then let's dive into the history of this, because at the end of the day, it's a history of political thought. The issue that feminism is reacting against, right, male dominance over woman, is a very old one. It goes back to biblical times and before that, right? And it is enshrined in various different institutions, right? This dominance is enshrined in the family structure itself. It's enshrined in politics. It's enshrined in religious, right? Politics and how rights work. Religion. In if you ever read the full Bible in the Old Testament, you'll see that especially in the Old Testament, women are just characters who are baking cookies on the background, right? And now and then they're traded and things like that. They're not considered of any relevance compared to the men in the story. Or just think in the New Testament, you just think of the mother of Christ, Maria, right? Just think of how you commonly in Mexico refer to Maria. You don't call her Maria. How do you call her?
In the north, or at least here in Monterrey, it's Tia Maria or something. No?
I think it's the Virgin Mary.
Virgin Mary.
Ah,
Yes.
I'm sorry, I got confused. Sorry.
Yeah, we're not talking about your Tia. We're talking about
Sorry.
the Virgin. Imagine you were a world famous figure that's remembered 2,000 years after you died. And the most important thing people remember about you is that you're a virgin, right? It would be quite embarrassing, do you know? That 2,000 years from now, they think of Mr. Marcello and they say, ah, the virgin. That would be, this is not very great. So that tells you a bit, right, about the roles and the importance of certain roles in history. Um, and that is also true within political philosophy, right? Within political philosophy or within philosophy, there's a lot of sexism. To give you one example, is of Arthur Schopenhauer. This is my favorite. Arthur Schopenhauer is an all-around loser of a philosopher, in my opinion. He's the teacher of Nietzsche, which doesn't tell you much good. Um, but one of his lowest points is when he wrote a book about women. So Schopenhauer, he wrote a book. I think in English it would translate as "On Woman," but the title in Dutch is much more interesting. It is "Er is geen vrouw die deugt," which literally translates as "There exists no good woman," or "Good women don't exist." And the thesis of this book is that women are inherently evil because they cannot do things on their own. They're too weak. Therefore, they will try to achieve things by manipulating men. That's, let's say, his main thesis in this book. And this was mainstream. This is one of the mainstream philosophers, right? So this dude is really a joke character, Schopenhauer. But at some point in time, this was commonplace. So there's a lot to react against, right? And if we have to look at some kind of sympathy towards women in this sort of political thought, we will mainly find that in what I would call the communist family tree. People like Plato, which you would say is kind of like super grandfather of communism in some ways. We saw with Plato. Plato had some actual feminist ideas. Not because he just thought that women were basically equal on the inside as men. It's not a feminist idea, that's just a rational idea. But what made him feminist is that when he was talking about politics, he took into account the domestic situation of women. He understood that women don't just need education, they need to be, if they want to be politicians, they need to be freed of their other tasks. That's why he wanted politicians not to have family, right? Or if you have children, then someone else is going to take care of them. He took into account what it would take for a woman to actually participate in equal footing. And that is a kind of feminist notion of him. Then much later, people kind of forget about this cause. People who really pick it up again are the first communists. So Marx and especially Engels, who you should be reading by now in the Communist Manifesto. Engels, who was kind of a player himself, but he was definitely attentive to how women were treated. And he wrote a book about the family under capitalism, in which, amongst other things, he criticized how the bourgeoisie was treating their women, basically treating them as if they were any other property in their possession. So with that comes some critical thinking. And the guy to really push it would be Lenin, Vladimir Lenin, the first president of the Soviet Union. He was the first political leader to ever give full legal equality to man and woman, to actually do it. Also, the very word feminism comes from this family tree. It was Charles Fourier, a socialist, a French socialist, who first used the word feminism. in 1837. But as you noticed, all of these people, dear students, are men, right? That's why I say that they are concerned with the position of women. I'm not saying they're feminists, because feminist movement, of course, starts when women also take an interest in this. And this movement, dear students, we can usually, or is usually categorized, is usually narrated in a terminology of waves. We talk about different waves of feminism, because the content of feminism shifted over time. It focused on different issues. There's some debate about how many waves there are, 3, 4, 5, or whatever. I'm going to keep it simple. I'm going to explain this in 3 waves. Okay? I assume you're ready for that. So, dear students, let's start with the first wave of feminism that actually started, right? The earliest writing on it. And this is about rights for women. So here we're talking about very early authors, such as Mary Wollstonecraft, which is the coolest name ever. Wollstonecraft. I would rename myself into that. Mary Wollstonecraft. In 1792, that's just a few years after the French Revolution, she wrote one of the first actual feminist manifestos, which is a vindication of the rights of women. It's not written like a manifesto, like it's not just it's not a list of rights. It's a much more literary work. But she's one of the first authors here. And what she does, and what this first wave of feminism does, is make the case for political equality for women, right? For women to have equal citizen rights as men. Because we are entering times, as we saw at the French Revolution, in which we start talking about citizen rights, right? Le droit de l'homme et du citoyen. As it says the right of man and citizen, not the right of man and woman and citizen, right? So there's a kind of a separate struggle to gain political equality for women, to have women recognized as citizens, because as we saw in the course, for example, in Greek times, they're not included, right, into politics. So this comes with political rights, but also with other basic citizen rights. For example, the right to own property. Women always could own, shoes and things like that. But property is in big property, as in the States, right? For example, in England, at some point in time, if you were the daughter of a rich industrialist, you were married, and your dad would die, then that factory would be inherited by your husband, not by you, because you as a woman could not handle these responsibilities, of course. So you would not get that property, even if you were the next one in line. Also, marriage was not necessarily equal. Once divorce became legal, in some countries only men could request a divorce and not women. Same with parenting. In sharp contrast to these times, originally men would have the right to custody. They would at least decide who would get the children. Right now we have went to the other end of the spectrum, where men are at all kinds of risk of never seeing their children again, if the woman wants to be mean about that. And the other type of rights, or example type of rights, of course, is the right to vote, right to vote in democratic countries, which surfs on the wave of the push for democracy that we've already been talking about, right? With Rousseau, with the French Revolution. There's a lot of talk of democracy, a lot of talk of citizen rights, but it's in some countries it was the same for men and women, but in some countries there was, let's say, a separate struggle, right? So we had the right for democracy, but not for poor people, or not for black people, or not for women, right? And definitely not for poor black women. So you had to regain this right again and again for different groups. And this was quite a slow struggle, actually. To show you this, So Wollstonecraft start talking about this in 1792. This is when women actually got it in various countries. And I'm talking about the full vote on a federal level. Full means that it's unconditional. You don't need to pay for it. Because in many countries you got the right if you paid for it, but that's not really fair. So in Italy in 1945, Mexico a bit later in 1953, Belgium 1948, Japan 1947, Monaco, much more conservative place, later 1962, Netherlands early. So first was Soviet Union, was Lenin, but right after that you had the Netherlands following suit, at least in terms of voting. Then you had France 1944, Turkey's interesting. Turkey 1934. Pay attention to this, right? Turkey, a Muslim majority country, had equal rights for women before Mexico or Japan did. Yeah, so all racists out there, you should not be too prejudiced about that. And then Switzerland. Switzerland always the example, right? If you want to talk about a good country that we should compare ourselves to, you usually talk about Switzerland. Except that in Switzerland, women didn't have the right to vote until 1971. And that is on a federal level. On a state level, women did not have the right to vote until 1994. That's when women in Switzerland got the right to vote for their governor. So Switzerland, not as great as you always think it is, right? So this is quite, this took a while. And one last thing I want you to notice is that most of the things they're asking for are really relevant to rich women. Because in many countries you have to pay to vote, right? So that doesn't apply to poor people. Also, most people are not going to inherit a factory, right? Or inherit everything at all. So this was mainly an upper class movement. Also because the upper class women were the only women who were able to push it. Because they could, for example, read and write because they were educated, right? So they could write books about this. Mary Wollstonecraft was the daughter of a rich person. That's why she could do these things. Also, poor women do not have time to participate in this movement, especially in that time. There was no washing machines or anything like that. So women spend most of their time, basically all time they were awake, just trying to manage the household. So you didn't have time to write books about these things, right? That would only come much later. So this was pushed by the upper class, to their credit, right? So that's the first wave of feminism. And this was a global movement, right? At the beginning, it started in Europe, but this made waves all over the world, right? Even in places like Afghanistan. Before the Americans ruined it, Afghanistan was communist, and women had full equal rights there. That's not exactly what you associate with it today, right? But this first wave went very broad across the earth. The second wave is a bit different. So the second wave of feminism is more about social equality. As I said, the first wave was predominantly a high-class movement, and for most women it didn't make a difference. For example, in Mexico, if a woman you got the right to vote, now you got to choose. No, you got the right to vote for the PRI or the PRI. So doesn't really matter anyway. And you know, most people are poor, so all these property rights, etc., didn't really make that big of a difference in their lives. Because formal equality doesn't mean real social equality, right? It's not because you have the same constitutional rights as men that you will be treated the same as men, or that you got the same opportunities as men, or that men will not abuse you, right? They're very different things. Treatment and rights are very different things. So formal equality is not real social equality. And as we need to move beyond this, we need to move beyond this liberal idea of, oh, well, women have these rights, so everything is good. And focus on actual social justice and discrimination. That's what the second wave was about. It was about pointing out what was actually wrong in the position of women in real life, not on paper. So they focus on discrimination, both in the public and the private sphere of life. In terms of public discrimination, for example. This was about how in the labor market, if women were to work at all, they would typically work in jobs for women, like nurses, for example. And there were other jobs that were simply jobs for men, and women would not be in them. The army is a clear example of that, but various other functions too in society were not held. Most executive functions were not open to women. But you also had segregation, for example, in education. Now, I don't know if this still exists, separate school for men and women. I went to one in primary school, at least. But that is not the problem. The problem is not that you have girls and boys separated. The problem was that girls' schools and boys' schools had different programs, completely different programs, where girls would not learn about math, for example, or not beyond simple math, like enough math to do groceries, but not statistics or things like that, or no equations. So, girls could then not go on and study to become engineers because they never had the basis of that. Instead, girls would spend a lot of time learning sewing or learning how to cook or things like that, right? My wife, at some period in her life, she for 1 year attended a school like this, a boarding school. So she learned to be a wife. She's certified in that. Right? But at some point in time, this was her choice. At some point in time, this was mandatory. So that's a big problem for equality, right? So girls from the start could actually never do certain things because they would not learn it in school. That's in the public domain. Secondary feminism also politicized the role of women in the private domain. So now we're talking about the role of woman or the position of the woman within the family, especially in 1950s conservative single earner family, right? Where only the man works. This has a lot of advantages if you're sociologically honest about that. For example, wages are higher, which makes it better for single people, right? Because your employer needs to pay you as if you're the only person earning in your household. So if you don't have a family, you still earn like that. So living standards were higher in these times, but long term for women and for their psychology, right? This is not good to always be sidelined, and there were all kind of problems with that psychologically. Yes, that's when you start promoting the image of the perfect family. So they start politicizing that, but it was not just about equality. Secondary feminism also started to point out the specific problems that women dealt with and start to make them political. It's about politicizing female problems. So these are things that could happen to both men and women, like rape or domestic abuse, but that women are statistically just more likely to experience. And so the feminist movement took a stronger interest in that. Or it can be things that really only concern women, right? Such as pregnancy, which men cannot experience. So things like free maternal care, for example, right? It's an important feminist, second wave feminist issue, or birth control, things like that, right? So placing these things on the political agenda, taking them out of the private sphere, but having the government show interest in them was part of the second wave feminism. And so they start paying attention to the role of the woman and therefore also sexual inequality and gender. Now, as I said, this first wave was global. The second wave was much more of a Western movement, right? If you think of living conditions on the earth, this really only penetrated in Europe and Northern America and maybe some parts of South America, right? It is predominantly a Western movement coming out of the 1960s, kind of hippie May 68 movement for cultural emancipation. And just to name you two key authors here, I unfortunately don't have the time to elaborate, but at the start of the wave, you'd have Simone de Beauvoir, a communist writer, who wrote The Second Sex, which is kind of a weird book, but it's basically a history of the domination of women, mainly in economical sense that she writes. And a very different work is Brady Fried, an American author, journalist, The Feminine Mystique, in which she politicizes the position of housewives by studying them, by doing surveys. She was a housewife herself. She wrote a book about basically about her friends. But what's very political about this book is also makes a woman responsible for their own position. So she says, yeah, you're with this idiot and he treats you bad, but you knew he was a bad guy from the beginning and you were with him anyway, and you were going to school, but as soon as you found a handsome guy, you dropped out of school, right? You chose to do this. You gave up your job for this idiot. So she started kind of talking about female emancipation, but also talking directly to women about this and about their part in it, which made this a very controversial book because it sometimes seems that she was arguing against family values, etc. It was actually banned, I think, for a while. This is second wave feminism. I have a lot more to say, but I'm running out of time. I don't know where this comes from. So, third wave feminism, right? First wave is about politics, second wave is about socioeconomic issues, and the third wave is cultural in nature. So the third wave of feminism is about broadening the issue. The third wave still talks about things of the first wave, but it focuses a lot more on gender issues, and it focuses a lot more on basically anything that goes against male conservatism. So this group, this third wave, kind of connects to the gay movement, to the transgender movement. Basically, everyone who is against standard masculinity and the consequences that might have for women or for other people, etc. Right? It's a movement that's much more about diversity than before, and that's also true in the people in it. Most, not just many, most third wave leaders and theorists are lesbians, which has far-reaching consequences actually for how this movement is developing. So to keep this very diverse movement together, right? One of the central concepts that was introduced here, that's a very kind of trendy word to use today in progressive circles, is intersectionality. So if you want to sound fancy at a party, let's start talking about intersectionality. What it means is that it's about paying attention to the overlap of discriminations that women face besides being women. Because the problems of women, they don't just have because they're women. They have because they're also part of other groups. For example, because they are poor, or because they are black, or because they are Muslim, or because they are lesbian, right? These different categories add certain troubles to their situation. So it's not the same to talk about the problem of women in general as it is to talk about the problems of poor indigenous women, right? And so it's about also pointing out that feminist issues really relate to a lot of other problems. And if you want to be a good feminist, you shouldn't just care about women, but you should also care about things like poverty or sexual equality or racial equality, things like that, right? Because that's what, in practice, is going to affect women maybe even more than them just being women. Right? That's the idea of intersectionality, taking these different things into account. What also typifies and separates the third wave from other waves is that there's a stronger focus. It's much more individualist, this second wave. It's much more liberal. It's about you as a woman being able to do what you would want to do. It's about having the choice. It's about having opportunities, right? It's about expressing yourself, being who you want to be. About not having barriers, let's say professionally. It's about discussions like the glass ceiling, discussions like abortion, right? Rather than the more serious collective tone of the other two waves. The collective tone of the other two waves are about we we women, not me, of course, you women, are going to fight for very clear, identifiable rights, right? For equal education, for the right to vote, which was more get all aboard for this fight type of movements, while third wave feminism is more certain women fighting for certain rights that apply to them, right? That other women might not want, which makes it, in a sense, a weaker movement. So it's much more about cultural issues here. No, not necessarily, Ms. Marie. She asked about abortion, nationalism, or gender or prostitution, because certain people in the third wave movement are for prostitution. They would see it as a way to make money, right? But those are definitely issues that you hear a lot in the third wave movement. But it's not just about that. But that's part of it, yes. So it's about things like changing culture. It's much more cultural than it is about changing society, right? It's not a reaction against capitalism or anything like that. It's about things like what words people are allowed to use or not. For example, you might have noticed, my son on the background is trying to interrupt. You might have noticed that I address all men with sir or mister, and all my female students with miss. That's just my standard way of talking, because I can't remember all of your names instantly, especially if I never met you. So I will standard call you miss. Now and then, every so many years, some girl gets angry at me for doing that. Because she'll be like, oh, don't you know that miss comes from 2 centuries ago, when it used to be a difference between unmarried and married woman, and there's no functional equivalent for that of man. So really, you're discriminating me based on my marriage status by calling me miss. To which I say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it like that. Okay, right? Now and then, some feminist gets angry at me for that, right? It's also about things like harassment, abortion, free expression of sexuality, being able to kiss another girl, right? This is what third wave feminism, this is a type of issues that they're often about. Now, this does have a radical edge. So it's a broad movement, right? At the far end of this movement, we find a woman called Judith Butler. Judith Butler is a very serious philosopher. She's an actual philosopher. She's not just an activist. She wrote about all kinds of things. She wrote about Hegel. She wrote about violence. She wrote about things we've been discussing in the last weeks. But she's most famous for her book on gender, her 1990 classic, Gender Trouble. And in it, she makes a very radical argument. She has a radical understanding of both gender and sex as fully constructed, which means that she says that there is no such thing as man as woman. They're only improvised performances, which means that I might talk like this and I might look like a man, but really I'm not. I'm just pretending I am, right? I am performing to be a man rather than that I am a man, right? Yes, there's a difference in DNA, she says, but there's also a difference in eye color, and that's not a significant difference, right? So it's not really a thing. So you must take this very literal, right? She argues that there is no difference between man and woman. So you, Miss Allison, you are not a woman. You're not. I'm sorry to break it to you. You're not a woman. You just act like one. That's what Butler would say, which has very far-reaching implications, right? Besides that, she kind of ignores certain aspects of reality, and that that changes feminism, because you can no longer claim certain rights because you're a woman, because you're not a woman, you're just acting like one, she would say, right? So you would say, you know, if we all just stop acting like man and woman, then we would also solve the problem, right? So stop complaining, just stop being a woman, and then we would solve things. This is an interesting idea, right? But a very radical one. And you can imagine that a lot of women might feel slightly uncomfortable at this notion. She didn't. She is kind of trans lesbian person. She's not trans in that she's a man that pretends to be a woman. She's a woman who pretends to be nothing. So for her, this is not a problem, right? This is more the radical edge of things. But in this, you can see that one problem with third wave feminism is that it's a very broad movement and it's winning, right? Feminism is bigger than it ever was today. It includes more people and more issues than it ever did. However, it is no longer a coherent movement, right? First wave feminism is we're fighting for political equality. What are we fighting for? Political equality. Okay, everybody's aboard. Here, there is a lot of disagreement because a lot of the things, since they're individual, what people fight about, definitely not all women agree to, right? Prostitution, for example. Not all women are against prostitution. Transsexualism. Are trans women? You have very different opinions on this. People might for political correctness, say yes, but there are a lot of women who find it almost kind of insultive and would see it almost as a kind of new patriarchy that men now can choose to be women and see it as a kind of new invasion of their privacy and of their space. Abortion. Abortion is a big one. So today, in Mexican political reality, people who are pro-choice claim the banner of feminism, right? And we often say them in the same breath. Yet it is important for you to understand that if we look at opinion polls, for example, of Mexico, more men are pro-abortion than women. And both are minorities, right? And especially, for example, in case of rape, right? Abortion in case of rape, men are 10% more likely to be in favor of that than women. So most Mexican women are against abortion. That's a reality. So if you want to claim the banner of feminism and claim to speak for all women, if you're pro-abortion, this is a problematic position, right? That might actually alienate some women from the broader feminist movement because they want to be for equal rights and more security and all these things, but they are ethically conservative. So they don't like feminists because they associate feminists with people who, have fetus piñatas and things like that. And the same with gender roles and in relation to men. As I said, a lot of third wave feminists are lesbians, including, for example, Butler, which means that they don't really deal with men in their private life. And so their solution to living with men is often don't do it, right? Men are stinky, just kiss a girl. Which to the majority of women is not really a solution, right? So there's certain aspects of things that you just need to deal with. The third wave feminism, that you have very different, let's say, opinions on that, right? The same with sex as a construct. What Butler says is very offensive to certain feminists who'd say, no, women are really different. We think different, for example. Our rationality does function different, actually is better than men, because we can multitask and things like that. And there are a lot of things that are specific, things like maternity, etc. There are a lot of things that are specific to women, and we don't, it's not a good idea to pretend that men and women are the same. That makes it worse. And then you have people like Butler and her considerable following who would go against that. So my point is that one of the weaknesses of third wave feminism is it's a very big movement. But we sometimes forget that there's an immense amount of disagreement within it, right? So it's not the same, all my sisters on the same side as the first two waves were. And that is something to look into. Now I'm going to stop here, right, with my 3 waves. Next time, I'm going to talk about how feminism is not just relevant to women, but actually relevant to all of us. And also as men, we would have good reasons to take heed to some of the causes of feminism. I'm going to talk a bit about gender, and I'm also going to give some critical advice for the feminist movement. All right?
Yes.
Does anybody wants to yell at me for something that they say I said wrong? We have no time for questions now, but it is time for critique in case I offended you by saying anything.
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, I hope that was informative, but we're out of time. So I have to let you go, and I'll see you again next time, right?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Yes.
Have a good day.
Thank you, doctor. Have a nice day.
You too. Take care. See you next week. Bye.